This is Duke University.
Our second speaker in this session is Dr. Nidhi Trehan, who is a visiting fellow at the University of Delhi and deputy director of the American Montessori Public School outside Delhi. Is that true? Yes. Nidhi's education began as a Bachelor of Arts at Baylor University in Texas, and then a Master of Public Affairs at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Having survived Texas, she went to London. It seems an extremely good idea to me, where she completed her PhD. She has written, of course, many articles and book chapters and policy reports. She's also the co-editor of the Contemporary Romani Politics in Europe, Poverty, Ethnic Mobilization, and the Neoliberal Order. The paper today is on a dream, deferred Romani integration in contemporary Europe.
Yes. Thank you, and I take this opportunity to thank all of you. The morning was really productive, and just shows the importance of what Angela and Amy and all the wonderful people here at Duke University and Wake Forest have done. I just personally want to say that this is probably the first time in almost 3 years that I've been in a Romani Studies Forum. And for me, it's wonderful to be back at home in my community. And I just want to thank you again, Angela, for inviting me. So, okay, so we means Dr. Nando Sigona, who's now at Birmingham University, but was at Oxford earlier, and he was in the Refugee Studies Department, and myself, who just finished from LSE, and then I had a UCL ESRC postdoc in London in the Department of Public Policy, Political Science. So basically, I'm a political sociologist. We had published a book in 2009, which Professor Coates just mentioned, and we had looked at the issues of ethnic mobilization, poverty, and neoliberalism. Those were sort of the lenses that we were working with. Of course, when it was published, you don't realize how far you have to go until you get the criticisms and feedback. And I'm so happy that Dr. Van Baar is next to me. He's been one of the best interlocutors on the book and in general in this field, looking at and studying neoliberalism and really uncovering it. So without further ado, I will get into my paper now. And A Dream Deferred, of course, refers to Langston Hughes' poem, What Happens to a Raisin in the Sun, What Happens to Your... It's the poem called Harlem, by the way. Is this on? Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was off, so... Okay, so this is just a brief introduction for us to refresh ourselves again of where Roma are today in Europe. So I use the term autochtonous, which is used a lot in Central Europe. For those of you who are new to the field, there are a lot of countries in Europe that have actually recognized Roma in their constitutions, what they call national minorities. That also refers to former Yugoslavia, in which Roma were mentioned in the constitution and are to this day mentioned in the Constitution of Macedonia. It's also mentioned in the Austrian infrastructure on minorities, and I'm not sure if it's mentioned in the Austrian constitution, but they are considered a national minority in Austria. And of course, that doesn't refer to the Yugoslav Roma who've moved in after the collapse of Yugoslavia, but to the original Austro-Hungarian Roma who have been for centuries in Austria. Okay, so they are the largest autochtonous ethnic minority diaspora with a growing and relatively young population. So this is important because as you know, the demographics is very important. The rest of Europe appears to be aging, and Roma are not. Roma are a young, vital part of the future generations of Europe. I have put the figure 7 to 8 million, which is a conservative estimation. In the morning, people talked about 10 to 12 million. Again, you know, the politics of censuses and the politics of identity, they're just so fraught with different aspects. I remember in Bulgaria, you have a lot of Roma who identify themselves as Turkish, ethnic Turk first, and then Romani. So, you know, this is something, identity again is fluid. We've already discussed this in the morning. And I think Carol's paper also mentioned that. The perceived otherness of Roma, along with their strategic cultural homogenization, needs to be interrogated and has implications for what it means to be European. Again, strategic cultural homogenization, what we discussed in the morning, the essentialism, it is strategic. In the last 2 decades, with the rise of various Romani movements, pan-European, Romani solidarity has been based on the notion that we are one community. And so it is something strategic. Obviously, people in the community know that they belong to a particular group that may not share everything across the board, whether it's the dialect, whether it's language, but certainly from a political strategic perspective, this was something that has come, in the last 2-3 decades, I would say. So once again, Romani communities face high levels of exclusion from mainstream labor markets, and migration is one strategic response, enabling economic survival or upward mobility. Neoliberal policies exacerbate these tendencies. So as the economies of Central and Eastern Europe embraced neoliberal economic reforms, as they were called, the opportunities for staying in your home country and earning a decent wage, earning a decent living, shrank. Factories closed down. There's been wonderful research by that Hungarian sociologist who did that movie, Kertési, again. What he did is he took, I think it was 10 years ago, he took the same community and he put it in a film. And then does anyone know the name of that Hungarian who made a movie? Then he went back, I think it's, yes, Almashi. It's not Kertési, sorry.
No, I just sort of the research.
Okay.
That's true.
Okay, and then he went back to the same community and he covered what had happened to that community after 10 or 15 years, in the transition. So, he had looked at economic arts, he had looked at what had happened with neoliberalization, what were the actual, impact on these people, on these people's lives. So obviously, one response of Roma for survival has been to move to Western countries, even to the US, even to Canada, Australia, and immigrate. And in the case of UK, many Roma go for work, go back, build homes, that kind of thing. That thing is more accessible if you're on the same continent. So again, this is one survival strategy. So basically what's happened since the 1980s, late 1980s and 90s, is that you have an increasing movement where civil and political elites have engaged in policies which have tried to foster Romani integration. This, of course, not first started, but it was like when you had the sort of movement for accession into the EU, it became more visible at that time. And so certain policies around human rights, minority rights, these kinds of things emerged. In the case of Hungary, you already had such movements earlier, liberalist movements, for example, the Minority Roundtable, which tried to say, okay, we have Romani in the country, how can we create a forum, a state forum actually, to integrate them into the country. This is a form of political representation that was there. Thereafter, you had the minority self-government. So you had state institutions, but you also had a lot of activity at the international level. You had international NGOs. You had George Soros's Open Society Institute, which has come in and really funded a lot of the projects. Decade of Roma Inclusion, of course, being one of them, which has just now ended or is ending soon. So this emerged. The two main points, main time periods of 2004-2007, which was the accession periods, that resulted in a huge number of Roma then becoming officially citizens of European Union. But what does that actually mean? You know, when you became a citizen, does that mean you actually garnered the rights of citizenship right away? No, you didn't. It has been a long, painful process for many Roma to, you know, actually achieve those rights, even when you have, you know, you've found some work in a Western European country, you're not going to necessarily get your paperwork and be able to settle down and easily find, you know, a decent livelihood there. So this is one issue which is connected to migration again. Hope van Baar has, which I was going to come to later in my presentation, the securitization of migrant Roma. And the other aspect is the criminalization also of migrant Roma. So both these securitization and criminalization, they've actually increased, I would say, in the last decade as Roma have moved in greater numbers to these countries. So, as I mentioned, Hope van Baar had studied this area, and I will be talking about some of his contributions. Can I hold this mic? Yeah, I think this is better. Okay, so again, there have been you know, local level institutions which have worked in the areas of, you know, educational access, anti-discrimination legislation, reskilling, income generation, etc. And all these areas, one can look at not just governance, but what Foucault and van Baar has used in his book on governmentality. And this definitely looks at the paradoxes around how these institutions have actually implemented some of these so-called progressive policies. You're going back, this is just an image I wanted to show to you about globalization and human rights, minority rights. This was a photo taken in 2001 by a Yugoslav Macedonian Romani activist, Sarita Yashrova, and it shows Aladar Adam, who's from the Ukraine, from Transcarpathia. And it's very interesting, he's in Durban in South Africa at this World Conference Against Racism, which, by the way, was mired in controversy there. I don't know, did anyone go there? Was anyone? Okay. You organized it, okay. So here we have Aladar, and he's playing a guitar. It says, racism and ethnic conflict are the handmaidens of neoliberalism. Now, I want to contextualize this for you. He's actually sitting in the Dalit stall. You know, Dalits, the Indian minority group, which is really oppressed, which actually makes up the majority of Indians, by the way. So that's something interesting. This kind of global advocacy and visibility that you have. And these activists were sponsored, I think, mainly by OSI, Open Society Institute. So if it wasn't for OSI funding, they wouldn't have gotten to Durban and wouldn't have been able to meet global human rights activists. So these are the kinds of developments that have been taking place in the last 15 years at a global level. And in the meantime, you also have the community and grassroots level. So the different areas, different levels of activist intervention is important to study. Okay, so what I wanted to discuss is that Europe is actually at a crossroads today. So despite all these progressive policies, all the Copenhagen criteria, and various national action programs on Roma for achieving their human rights and integration, in fact, there has been rising unemployment. And how do you deal with that? What are countries doing about that? That's something I wanted to ask the people from the decade, actually. What's actually happened is because of economic marginalization, you just have a very dangerous tendency now for the far right to get back and sort of reassert all the horrible stereotypes on Roma and therefore marginalize them further. So this is again something very serious. I wanted to address the issue of what I had mentioned in my book on neoliberalism. And I totally agree. I say I concede with von Baer that the politics of representation needs to be integrated beyond the global hegemonic liberal power versus local grassroots community resistance binary. Because in the book that we published in 2009, there was probably a kind of imbalance in which we tended to blame all that had happened on neoliberalism, okay, and not necessarily deconstructing what neoliberalism was. And certainly the use of neoliberal tools to repoliticize and maybe reappropriate progressive agendas for Roma is also there. I mean, that's coexisting with some of the regressive aspects, of neoliberalism. So von Baer talks about something he calls traveling activism, okay? And this is, again, this is something that's been used by a lot of the international Roma activists in concert with local activists. There are these tendencies to, there's like a cross-fertilization, that's what I mean to say. And I think, I don't know if Hope wants to take this up further in his paper. How much time do I have? Okay, right. Okay, so, yeah. What are the implications for Romani integration in this context, which I've just explained? That, although you have these, wonderful human rights regimes, how are the actual human rights of Roma being achieved or not being achieved? So the fate of rural Roma, connected to the hollowing out of economically depressed villages in former Central Europe, that is, more than 50% of Roma live in rural areas or small towns in Eastern Europe. The rise of the right and rightist centrist movements means that Roma socioeconomic exclusion will continue. So again, migration as an option is there, but it's precarious. Identity, politics highly complex, and freedom of expression. Yeah, this is something interesting. So now, finally, Roma can express themselves, in the last 10, 15 years. But the question is, how is that expression being used to actually achieve, integration? Yes, they're free to express self-determined thought, but how does that actually translating into, something that can be more meaningful in terms of livelihood and integration? So yeah, I've already mentioned the role of civil society, Romani media, and rise of representation at the European level. So this is something interesting theoretically that I wanted to raise, that if you have now the notion of Roma as a European minority, and European governance and governmentality is now something that you'll be analyzing to look at that. Can you actually say that, Roma would be able to be considered European without necessarily first being able to be considered part of the nation that they belong to? Because when you had socialism, there was that possibility that you were, a Hungarian first, okay, and a Romani second, okay, if you joined the socialist communist project. But now, what kind of, are you going to do a kind of leapfrog? This is actually a question for Hope, that can you actually say that you can be a Europeanized minority without necessarily going through the process of being considered a national first, national of your country? And I'm now talking about, the concept of civic nationalism, which is what you have in America and Canada and Australia, to some extent in France. So I'm not talking about ethnic nationalism, obviously. So that's just a question for later. Okay. I think I've covered a lot of these issues already about the prospects for work, documentary status, and research on securitization. Right. So again, this is going to be addressing some points which were raised in the book by Hope. He calls it a politics of citizenship as participation within a neoliberal human rights agenda and framework, okay? So my question, again, and this will hopefully be covered by Hope, is that what is this actual politics, of participation? Is it again connected to the civic national model, of participatory democracy, being part of the citizenry, all that, or is it something beyond that? So that's actually a question for the next paper. And yes, so I've already covered securitization and criminalization, and I wanted to discuss desecuritization mechanisms, which again, Von Bar has raised. So, yeah. I wrote my paper mainly in response to Von Bar's book. So, because these are topics we've covered in earlier seminars over the years. So I hope those of you who are not non-Romani specialists or whatever, you will bear with me on this. So that's it for now. So, thank you. I've covered it.